Yeah, hello SGD. Before I begin this video, if you've just watched the previous part in regards to Seshat and the mystery schools and how they connect to Pythagorean, Platonic and up to Rosicrucians, Freemasons, you can skip the first 15 minutes because I'm just reviewing the last episode. So yeah, if you've just come off the previous episode, just go to the 15-minute mark, and otherwise it's a review. If you haven't seen the other part or want to hang around and watch the first 15 minutes for a review, well, you can do that too. But first 15 minutes, you can skip it if you've just watched part one. Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part two, and looking at the ancient Egyptian mystery schools with a focus on Thoth, also Djibouti, also called, but Seshat and She Who Scribes. I've done an earlier series on Seshat and Heliopolis, and I'll be adding to it because of this. I've been looking at this concept of the 0 point at the Khafre Valley Temple, how that creates a calendar, and the archaeoastronomy with the solstice, winter and summer, as well as the equinoxes, and how some other connections coming back to Seshat. And the Khafre Valley Temple, which has this T-shaped hall with this very simple block technique, as well as those fitted walls, which is very unusual in comparison to the typical Egyptian architecture. And just like the pyramids, no writing, no hieroglyphs on there. There were the casing stones. There has been one old chronicler from the 13th, 14th century spoke of coverings of hieroglyphs, but the old photos before the casing stones were removed from the base, there were no hieroglyphs on that pyramid or any pyramid. Only later with the smaller pyramids such as Unas, Pepi, etc. did we have the pyramid text being written on the inside. So Khafre Valley Temple, this form of architecture, very simple, essentially geometric, just like the pyramids, and also has at the Osiron, very similar style. And of course at the famous Flower of Life is geometry at the Osiron as well, and that I want to go more into this in the future. The size and the shaping of the blocks, in early looking, I've just looked at it briefly, but there's fruit here. It's going to bear fruit from what's happening, but there is a language written in this stone which can be accessed through astronomy, geometry, arithmetic, and music, the quadrivium. These are the areas of Thoth and Seshat. So also as in the earlier series, earlier videos in the series in regards to unlocking the Giza Plateau, so whether it was at Thebes, Abydos, Elephantine, all these places across Egypt, the geometry of the layout is a repeated pattern that can be found inside at not just the individual pyramids such as Khafre, but the larger complex at the Giza pyramids, and how they relate, of course, to the seasons and the sun, solstice, equinox, etc. And how these mystery schools have the same themes that are so important in the Pythagorean schools, the Platonic schools, and these other mystery schools leading up to the alchemists and the hermeticists of the Renaissance, leading to Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, the early Theosophists, and this very interesting, where there was an explosion of knowledge and science and geometry. Well, we have the same and beautiful architecture. Each period in history seems to be following the same pattern of this essentially geometric underpinnings to all of it. So the pyramids, the writing is geometry, it's in astronomy. There is no written text, but the text is the stone itself. By understanding the proportions and the metrology, just like at Khafre Valley Temple and just like at the Osiron. Now let's look at the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, very famous because it includes a king's list, but the king's list only begins with Nama at Temple of Seti I. It excludes a lot of important kings. I think it's much better to look at the Nama palette than the royal annals and these older kings lists which have these pre-dynastic kings in there. But so from Temple of Seti I, also we're going to visit again and look at Heliopolis. city of the sun, or Iunu, or On as it's called. It's mentioned a few times in the Bible as well. So Heliopolis now, it's in the suburbs of Cairo. The whole place was torn to shreds and the stone was recycled to make a lot of those large mosques and public buildings in Cairo. They used casing stones, yes, but that's on the other side of a river. Heliopolis was a huge complex, and that was the major source for a lot of the stonework in Cairo. Whereas Strabo, Herodotus, they speak of the importance of Heliopolis as a center of astronomy, of timekeeping, and science, philosophy in general. I mentioned earlier how Plato, Eudoxus, the ancients tell us, were initiated in Heliopolis and for Platonic schools. So whether it was at the time of Plato, but definitely later, shortly after, let no one ignorant of geometry enter my door. So just like with Thales and Pythagoras, who also were said to have studied in Egypt, and this explosion of Greco-Roman knowledge being so closely linked to the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians, Chaldeans. So these mystery schools, Plato and Pythagoras, and how they're so important, for instance, to the liberal arts at Chartres or Cologne. These cathedrals, which are again embedded with geometry and arithmetic and metrology, and that the building is the textbook. It's not a nice published book with ISBN number, but the buildings themselves encode this knowledge, and how that was so important and to be found in Rosicrucian Freemason texts and imagery. So Heliopolis was the center by the time of Alexander and the Ptolemaic era. Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria became the center of learning. People such as Hieron of Alexandria with automatons, steam engines, self-opening doors, also who wrote very scientific textbooks on surveying, on lifting, and these technologies. So to lift massive blocks of stone, which they did, they also left us the text to do it. But so this would be the best way to get an understanding of how pre-Greco-Romans did it, because they learnt from the Library of Alexandria, and they were able to do it with simple technology, and they left us very clear-cut records on that. And also the astronomy, such as Aristarchus of Samos, who was a student at the Library of Alexandria. His heliocentric and precession texts survive and were written about and developed by others. Then the geocentric version come back in, and then eventually, of course, we come back to heliocentric version. But this Eratosthenes measuring the size of the Earth, prime numbers, and these types of things. So how much of this knowledge was a development at the library, or was it a reconstruction of older texts? So Eratosthenes used the well of Syene. He knew that on the summer solstice that the sun would shine directly into the well, and then on the same day, on the solstice, he would measure the angle at Alexandria to measure the polar circumference of the Earth. Was this something that he discovered purely on his own, or was he just rediscovering these ancient texts? And this idea of geometry, Earth, metry, measure. Also concepts such as the 360-degree compass and mapping technology, which goes again back to the Roman times. So again, was this such as longitude and latitude? We think of that as being more modern, but it was actually done in ancient times. And was it purely a discovery of the Romans at Alexandria and such other centers, other libraries? Or was it a rediscovery of ancient knowledge? Well, as we saw in part one, it's even in the Rig Vedas and these ancient Indian texts as well. Because just like with Babylonians, there's evidence that they had the Archimedes screw, but they described it in a language that is unusual to us, as where Archimedes, Hieron, Vitruvius, these Greco-Roman writers, they write in a language that is very understandable. It's essentially the same as our modern texts, scientific texts. But if you look at the older ancients and you read it through that lens of science, and just understand what their language was and their description. So we think of a screw, we have a certain image of it. The Babylonians have a description of an Archimedes screw to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. There's a lot of great evidence to suggest they had an Archimedes screw to deliver the water to the garden. It has always been one of the mysteries of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, how they were able to deliver the water. And they describe the spiral shape of a palm tree. There's been some great studies and looks into that. And well, yeah, so how much of the Greco-Roman Archimedes and these type of people was actually a rediscovery and just translated into Greek and Latin, which forms the basis of the modern languages that we use now. But that these concepts of 360 degrees divided into 60 minutes, divided into 60 seconds, seems to be a legacy of the ancients. But so to understand the ancients, well, let's look at the ancients who left us records from places such as Alexandria and Heliopolis, and we see that there is a strong case to suggest that they were just simply publishing information that has survived and been passed on to us now. But whether it's lifting massive stones, surveying with great precision, measuring the earth, measuring time, well, the Greeks and Romans are pointing to us back to Alexandria and especially back to Heliopolis. And that's going to be an important theme. So how, again, with the 0 point and the distances and the angles, we have geometry, earth, measure, evidence there. The same systems, these beautiful numbers, harmonic numbers, Pythagorean tuning being the basis for this. And it can be found, again, across cultures as well. They always seem to be coming back to these numbers, whether it's the Indians, the Sumerians, and it just, yeah, lovely tie into so many examples of those harmonic numbers. Now, I did mention 288 and 432, but I didn't highlight it in the last video. For instance, D is 288 Hertz. In Pythagorean tuning, 432 Hertz is A, and they are at this 2 to 3 ratio, the perfect fifth, or it's referred to as a Hermetic constant, which emerges from the Vesica Pisces, Pythagorean tuning, Pythagorean theorem, the geometry, those mystery schools, and again those ratios between, which is embedded in not just ancient Egyptian architecture, but right up until the modern era, especially connected to masonry. So more on these harmonic numbers. I'll put the playlist in the description where I go through the whole, and you'll see just whether it's 144, 288, 864, 108, I go through the whole series and show the geometry, the astronomy, the arithmetic, weights and measure systems of the ancients, even how it's embedded in modern systems of science. I'll also, because it's related, I did a series on the pentagram and how the pentagram and the angles contained in there have this, for instance, 288. The same system is repeated, and with very simple geometry, 360 degrees is in 360 days in the old calendars. Yeah, it's some really lovely stuff going on in there. I just think it's hidden in plain sight. Pythagorean Theorem and those connections again to Egyptian architecture. That geometry again, of course, in the Osiron, in the Flower of Life, all based on the Vesica, as you know, the old 4x3 or 16x9 modern resolution, which is embedded in the pyramids, but the Parthenon, the great cathedrals, even in stone circles, places such as Karnak in France. So these secret fraternities, or these academies such as Pythagoras and Plato, often referred to as number cults, but the Egyptian influence on greats such as Pythagoras and Plato, or Zoroaster and the alchemy therein, and also just the philosophy in general, it's always pointing us back to the ancients, and the Greeks and Romans, etc., tell us quite explicitly they learnt it from the Babylonians and Chaldeans and the Egyptians. So that's now what we find is it's more makes great fiction, but the Rosicrucians, or especially the Freemasons, because they're the most famous, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, the quadrivium, and how, of course, a geometric symbolism, the compass and square, the 3, 4, 5 triangle, this ancient lovely knowledge which goes, I would say, goes back much further than the traditional viewpoint is, that it emerged from the Greek period. Well, It's part of a very ancient tradition, of course, as in the Sumerian kings list, 288, 432, 108, 360, etc. Also in the Bible, in descriptions such as New Jerusalem, which is exactly the same as the Epic of Gilgamesh, just with a couple zeros added at the end. These particular sets of numbers, Sumerian, the Yugas, and also in the Rig Veda, also how they connect to the angles of the Great Pyramid, which of course links us to the 120 days. It's the same sets, same numbers, just expressed one in angles, one in time. And of course then we lead us to geodesy, earth measure, geometry, in all sorts of formats. So, and again, not just the Great Pyramid, but just to focus on the Great Pyramid, diagonal points exactly to the Heliopolis, the sacred mound. The base length of the pyramid, including the sockets, times 100 is a distance from the closest corner to Heliopolis, and that also has this geodetic information in there. And of course the alignment and arrangement of Heliopolis itself is just reflecting the Great Pyramid, also the causeway to the Khafre pyramid and those connections with that astronomy. So now geometry, geo, earth, metry, measure, these academies, secret societies, fraternities, number cults, would it call them what you will. And back to the 0 point. Now the Khafre Valley Temple, here we see an example of that stonework, which is very rare, limited basically to the Khafre Valley Temple or the Osiron, places that have no writing but have this geometry in there, just like the pyramids themselves. So we see the T-shaped hall, and again those blocks and that form of stonework, very similar to the stonework in, for instance, the Parthenon, no straight lines, all right angles. So now that's your Khafre Valley Temple style. There we have a more typical Egyptian form of architecture. So Khafre Valley Temple and the Osiron, very different. And of course the Osiron does have the flower of life. Now let's look at Temple of Seti I at Abydos with that King's list. That's also the angle reflecting the Khafre pyramid, which is the angle reflecting the movement of the sun over the 120 days of the season. So that's the outside to the main part of the temple as it's now. There has been some reconstruction, restoration work, but you do see the carvings out there. Now that's they're not circular on the outside. There's circular round columns inside, but on the but inside and out it's very richly decorated. It is the typical Egyptian style. We can see the inside the round columns, and of course on the inside a lot of this beautiful artwork with the original pigments still survives. On the outside it's been faded, and so we do see traces of this color, but what it looks there's on the inside, this is how it would have looked in the olden times. This is how these temples used to look. Same with, for instance, the Parthenon. The statues, for instance, their lips would be painted red, their hair would be painted in colors. The temple would be whitewashed and in lime, very beautiful, very white, very different. Now, because of a tourism trade, there's a tendency not to restore the temples to their original when they do restoration work, because people the tourists want to see them like this. But in former days, in the glory, this whole would have been brilliant colors. He's raising the Jed and his Thoth with his two rods, Lower and Upper Egypt, coming together. And now Temple of Seti I has multiple references to Seshat in there, very important. So just as you enter, you would see, again, you see the 7 points there above, and the scribe. She's even got the scribe tools there. It's maybe a bit hard to make out. And the Palm Frond. Stretching the cord ceremony with Seshat in there. Because of the screenshots where I was taking this video from, I had to overlay it, but you can see where I've got the 2 different shots, and this is how it would figure out. Foremost of the builders, one of her titles, she was of course a goddess of maths and accounting.
the palm frond. So that's your palm frond, but when you strip it, essentially it's a tally stick. So when you see whether it's Seshat or Thoth, with this palm frond, it's a counting tool. It's, again, you see the scribe's tools as well in her hand. She was the inventor of writing. There's other multiple images of Seshat here at the temple of Seti the First. I would think that the number cults, the academies of Seshat, the goddess, math, geometry, architecture, etc., and the temple of Seti the First next to the Osirons seems to be, at least in my opinion, one of these where it was still happening. By that time she had diminished. She had, so Osiris and Isis were now really popular, but the old gods from the old kingdom, even prior to the dynastic period, seem to have faded. Like Atum and etc. become less and less popular, and then it moved into Anubis, Isis, Osiris. But here we see Seshat, that out of way, instructing Thoth on writing. She invented it. Thoth taught it to humanity. These are more images, again, of her with the stylus, the writing tool, and I think there's something interesting with the way she holds her pen. So back to the 0 point. This is all based on the seasons, and now we see this is so it looks like a male figure, but it's Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh, stretching the cord, arranging a new temple there with Seshat. So Seshat would always assist the pharaoh in creating this. Now you would note this is from the later period, but we see the symbol is it has the old style with the two sticks basically pointing up. But what's different is you see that the 7 points now are basically at 45 degrees from each other. The old style is like this. This is from the Weaponetheret, and these are one of the very, very old depictions of that Seshat symbol. So just to zoom in, you can see how it's basically 45 degrees, but the older version is less of an angle. Lots of work done. The concept of Mesketyu, stretching this cord, arranging the temples to the north. So this can be just like with ancient Indian architecture. They would arrange their temples using a gnomon, basically a stick in the ground, and you can trace out the movement of the sun. Then you can find east and west and use the North Star to find north. But also if you were to leave it there and measure it over the year, you could also get the solstice and the equinox pattern. And that's what I think, well, there's an interesting little connection in regards to these symbols in here. So you'll notice how, okay, I'll show you. So your 0 point, where the solstice, equinox and winter solstice all come together. If we overlay that, this older symbol very closely matches those particular angles. It's not at 45 degrees like, for instance, here. The later period, the older ones have the leaves bunched more together, and they very closely match that solstice, equinox, winter solstice arrangement. And of course we have the sighting tool to find north, as in the stretching the cord ceremony. We observe the movement of the stars. We align our temple to Mesketyu, the north. Just a couple of days ago I posted a video on the opening the mouth ceremony ritual, and how the actual tool called Mesketyu reflects the bull's foreleg, or the Big Dipper as we call it now, which is how sailors, navigators find the North Star. So Temple of Seti, Abydos, that same type of architecture, just like with the pyramids. And if we look at Heliopolis, earlier video, how not just the 3 pyramids at Giza, but also these other pyramid fields, pointing not just to Heliopolis, but to the sacred mound, the Ben Ben mound, creation point of the Ennead. Here's some photos, some recent excavations at Heliopolis, and there you can see, for instance, you see the size of these limestone blocks and compared to the size of a man there. So it was the huge walls temple complex at Heliopolis was the primary source of the building of Cairo. The casing stones of a pyramid were used, but they were on the other side of a river. But we still see just the surviving stone here, and if you look into heliopolisproject.org, where they found the surviving bits of the wall was huge, and that doesn't include the temples inside. Strabo's geometry, as well as Herodotus, speak of the Heliopolis as a centre of learning. Herodotus, for the people of Heliopolis are said to be the most learned of the Egyptians. The whole place was full of obelisks. If you want to see the obelisks of Heliopolis, best off going to Rome. For instance, they're in the front of the Pantheon. And all the, not all of the Lateran obelisks, for instance, come from Karnak, but there are multiple obelisks from Heliopolis in Rome. You also find one in Florence. There's only really one surviving one in Heliopolis now, and a stump of another. But also Cleopatra's Needles of London and New York. They were brought from Alexandria, but those were transferred from Heliopolis to Alexandria, and there they stood for 2,000 years before being moved to New York and London. So Heliopolis, primary sanctuary of the goddess Seshat, the goddess of wisdom, knowledge, geometry, astronomy, surveying, construction, foremost of the builders as she was called. So we looked at Khafre Valley Temple, the Osiron, have that style of architecture, but what did Heliopolis look like? And we can get, so here are some cuts from Strabo where he visited and he describes it, and we can just narrow that down to a few important bits. And it contains the ancient temple constructed in the Egyptian manner. Also he references the obelisks. It was basically a forest of obelisks. If you go to Karnak, for instance, that's where most obelisks are, and there's only a handful of them there. If you wanted, in ancient times, if you wanted to see obelisks, you'd go to Heliopolis. So, it contains the ancient temple constructed in the Egyptian manner. After the sphinxes, one comes to a large propylum. That's a gate. So again, these trapezoid doorways and gates. So this is an image, older image of Karnak, common theme. That's the typical Egyptian style. Throughout its whole length, a stone sphinxes placed in order on each of its two sides. So rows of sphinxes, just like Luxor or Karnak, very traditional, the typical Egyptian manner. But what's interesting is when you come to this passage, there is also a kind of hall with numerous columns, as at Memphis, for example, which is constructed in the barbaric manner. 4. Except for the fact that the columns are large and numerous and form many rows, the hall has nothing pleasing or picturesque, but is rather a display of vain toil. Very much in the form of the Khafre Valley Temple or the Osiron. You don't have these hieroglyph-covered walls and columns. What we have is a barbaric manner, nothing pleasing or picturesque, a display of vain toil. Very similar to the pyramids, which are, for their size, is amazing, but there is no decoration, there is no writing, there are no pictures on there, but there is a form of writing, and that is geometry and arithmetic, music and astronomy, especially accessed through the metrology, the measures. Thoth and Seshat, gods of wisdom, knowledge, gods of weights and measure, geometry, astronomy. I'll link this video in the description where I go through the math inside just the Great Pyramid, but also the Lucas and Fibonacci series, which actually links Menkaure Pyramid and Khafre Pyramid to the Red Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, the Moidum Pyramid, as well as all the others such as Pepin, Neferefre, etc. And phi, pi, all these important mathematical constants. Even pi over 6 meters equals 1 Egyptian royal cubit. That's also in the pyramid. 4 over pi, which gives you the relative size of the Earth and the Moon, but also is the distances between the inner planets, like the astronomy of the planet. It's not just Sun and Moon and Earth, it's also the other planets as well. I'll link that video in the description. That's part of a longer series, Understanding the Great Pyramid and the Ancient Sciences. It's too much to condense, but if you just, if you're really interested, I know there's a lot of videos, a lot of time there, but if you go through, you'll see, I go through it with the measures and compare it to other ancient texts. It's measurable, it's testable, it's tangible, and if you build up a larger case, at some point coincidence ceases to be coincidence and it becomes clearly a pattern. Seshat, the Lady of Letters, the foremost of the builders, the goddess of, mistress of the house of architects, keeper of the houses of life, all the record keeping, the libraries and the books. These are all in her dominion, and it's so the only ancient goddess that could be responsible for all of this really is Seshat. Now also Thoth would be included, but when it comes to this architecture, the astronomy, the math, it's all really only place could be is with her. And as with the Platonic, and essentially the same thing was happening with the Pythagorean Academy, the language essential element was geometry, mathematics, astronomy, surveying, construction. It's all points to Seshat, but there's also, Seshat seems to be pointing to something, and you see she was the inventor of writing, and she holds the pen or the stylus, and I think there's something else happening in here as well. And geometry, geo, earth, metry, measure. So we come back, the reason for the seasons, so whether it's the 3 seasons of ancient Egypt or spring, summer, autumn, winter, as most people have, the reason for this is the tilt of the earth, 23.5 degrees, where that's why the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees north of the equator, Tropic of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees south of the equator. So when it comes to the solstice, the sun will go down a well at 23.5 degrees north or south of the equator. It won't. After that, it's going to cast a shadow. So Egyptian mystery schools, Thoth, Seshat. Now, how does this, of course, relate to more modern mystery schools, esoteric organizations? And here's pretty much a standard Masonic tracing board. Of course, we have the compass, we have the levels to find vertical, the level of a plumb line to find horizontal, the building square, the stoneworking tools, of course the compass, and most importantly the ruler. Thoth, Seshat, gods and weights and measure, just like Hermes, just like Nuar and Fuzi in ancient China, the same themes, where these gods of knowledge being closely related to astronomy, etc. And also note the stairway here, 3, 5 and 7. That's an important feature because that will link to other elements as well. Here's another tracing board. Now if I go back a moment, you see the 2 main pillars. Now there's actually a 3rd column, the Ionic, but here we have the 2 main columns where we have the celestial and the terrestrial sphere. Or is that's the terrestrial, that's the celestial, I believe. But we'll get a closer view when we look at this particular one. Now we see the 2 columns, and we have a terrestrial sphere, or the Earth, and we have a celestial sphere, and it's a bit hard to make out. I'll show you a better one in a moment, but we have the zodiac signs running around the outside there. And this is a common theme. So here's another type of tracing board. Notice 3 steps, 5 steps, and then 7. Also this Egyptian form of architecture. But we have the 2 pillars, 2 columns, the Earth, and you can get a hint of these constellations in there. That's the celestial sphere, and that's the terrestrial. Here's another example, 3, 5 and then 7 steps to 2 columns, the Earth sphere and the celestial sphere. You can see closer, more accurate, the zodiac signs, and you'll notice that the Earth is tilted and the celestial sphere is also tilted. It's an important repeated theme. But also for 5 steps, as they relate to the 5 orders of Roman architecture: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian and Composite. Now then we have in the middle Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, they're Greek orders, but the 5 orders is Roman. But you'll also note hearing, seeing, feeling, smelling and tasting, how they relate also to the senses. These 7 steps, we have grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, astronomy, music, and then geometry. It's a bit hard to read, but they're the 7 liberal arts, and the top 4 of those steps, arithmetic, astronomy, music and geometry, that's the quadrivium. So a celestial and terrestrial sphere. Now for instance here in New South Wales in Goulburn, you'll often find this in older architecture when Oddfellows, Freemasons, etc. were more prominent. Notice the obelisk, but we also have the tilted spheres on either side. This is a common theme in architecture, terrestrial and celestial. And this also relates to the tilt of the Earth, and I'll show you more. But the reason for the seasons, whether it's the solstice, equinox, well, this is the tilt and this important angle. Now, it's actually 23.43 or floating around there, but 23.5 is good enough for all purposes. Here's another more modern mason board, obviously during the computer age. We see again the tools of geometry and measure. And also note Jacob's ladder, which is an important feature of biblical tradition as well. But if we overlay that there, it's at that tilt. This is one of these hidden in plain sight things. If you've been around the internets for a while, you've probably stumbled upon the symbolism in the US dollar. Notice the pyramid, which there's a lot going on in there, but if we just, well, that's tilted at 23.5 degrees. It's representing again this tilt of the Earth, which is so important to precession and to astronomy and the seasons and understanding calendar, natural calendar. But of course we also have the compass and square, common Mason symbol. Now the angles of a compass will vary. There is not a fixed angle, but what you'll see very often, very common, is this particular angle, which is 47 degrees, which is 23.5 times 2. So if we use the inside edge of that, it fits in. Now even from the point and the outside edge, well, there's information in there too, but that's basically 6 degrees. I covered that earlier. So what we have is this important, whether it was modern Masons, Rosicrucians, going back to the 7 liberal arts schools at places such as Chartres and Cologne, these other secret schools, academies going back through time, back to Plato and Pythagorean academies. And again, they emerged, and they even state themselves, the old writers, that this knowledge emerged from Egypt and Babylon, Sumeria, also India. India is very important. But back to Temple of Seti I. So inside we have the famous image of raising the Jed. That too is tilted at 23.5 degrees. Now the dollar bill and the Jed is, it's been out there for a while, but also if you might notice that Thoth, who's the male equivalent of Seshat, he carries the 2 wands. Now wand in ancient language translates to measuring rod, and he has the lower and upper Egypt crowns, bringing those together. Now note the angle separating them. It is the same angle of these compasses. It's a very common theme in architecture and symbolism. That's 6 degrees and can be found also in at the Giza Plateau itself. Wall of the Crow, inside the pyramid. Well, it's a repeated thing. Earlier episodes in the series on the plateau. So for Jed, we also have that is... Now this image that I used here, I have others, and to find... Notice that when you use these, either you have to be on site with a tool, or finding what is perfectly horizontal. Well, you have to sort of rely. So this image is actually sort of seems to be tilted a bit. You can use, or for instance, these lines. Now I have other images which perfectly fit. This one's just a fraction off, but I could have chosen another image and it would have fitted perfectly. But I'm just now declaring that when it comes to these images I'm about to show, the camera has to be level, has to be on level ground, and it all has to be, because if it's a slight angle tilted up or down or side to side, it is going to affect it. I could have chosen another image that matches perfectly, but this one is very, very close. But it also depends on how level was the shot taken, how the position of the camera. Now back to the celestial sphere. So this all has to do with the tilt of the Earth from the vertical. But the same 23.5 degrees also affects the way we view, for instance, the 12 signs of the zodiac around the ecliptic. We're also seeing a 23.5 degree tilt. So one's vertical, one's horizontal. The Earth, vertical. The constellations of the zodiac are horizontal. And the reason for the seasons, yeah. Okay, so 23.5 degree tilt. So that's why where it's Orion, Taurus, etc., don't go directly over the top. They're at a tilt, which is the tilt of the Earth. So that brings it. So he's Seshat and Thoth behind one of the colossal statues at Luxor. That recent video I did on Mesketyu and the symbols there, you find that Mesketyu symbol as well as the adze and how it relates to northern stars. Also the Mesketyu tool, how that relates to stretching the cord and finding north. But so what you'll find is that Thoth will, as a rule, might be some exceptions, holds his stylus, his writing instrument, at a slightly higher angle than what Seshat does. And this is an important aspect because, again, it's difficult to get a photo that's precise. Now I have another angle again that would fit that 23.5 degree tilt much more precisely, but I'm just using that one, and again just declaring that this relies on the photo or being able to go on site and measure it much more accurate, but that's just one example. Now there are other, for instance, this is also this is Temple of Seti the First. We see Seshat with the Palm Frond. Note that again, finding the horizontal, when people take these films, the camera has to be perfect. But if I've just mirrored the image there, and again that's matching very closely. If I was to tilt that photo to find the horizontal, it actually would come pretty much spot on. Seshat again holding the pen, the stylus. That too comes very, very close, depending on, again, how horizontal, how level it is the camera, and how it has to be precisely centered on that position if you were to use this type of method. But there are so many other similar examples where Seshat's stylus is at a slightly lower angle than Thoth, and it's matching basically the horizontal of a celestial sphere. Seshat, Heliopolis, High Priest, Chief of the Observers, the Imhotep, etc., all there. The Egyptian mystery schools at 0 point, the Platonic schools, Pythagorean Thales, etc., these linking to other cultures who, in the sacred numbers embedded in Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, also in the Mayan system, and of course in Sumerian and the Greek system, Greek weights and measures. I linked the harmonic series that I did, and one of the episodes, if I remember rightly, I included it, or I go through all the weights systems of the Greeks and the Romans and how they divided up their units of weight. And it's all based on this particular method, the harmonic numbers, which were in, again, Vitruvius and these type of texts, treatises on weights and measures by Theosophanes, forget the exact pronunciation, speaking of the importance of these numbers and how it was in their weights and measure systems. Even old texts describe this as well. The connections between timekeeping, the compass, and the clock, and the similarities, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, etc. Linking to geodesy, geometry, which is not just in the pyramid or the Giza Plateau pyramid, but also how it relates to this most sacred site of Heliopolis. And of course, Heliopolis, those plans I went through in the earlier, I'll add this to the Unlocking the Giza Plateau series, where I go to Thebes, Abydos, Elephantine, and also speak about these other studies on archaeoastronomy in Egypt. And of course that earlier symbol of Seshat, stretching the cord ceremony, and how it very nicely ties into this solstice equinox symbolism, and that of course being her domain. Obelisks, yep. So the Osirian Khafre temple or the Great Pyramids, they don't, or Heliopolis, as I showed, no writing, no pictures, but if you apply metrology and geometry to them, you'll see that there is a very clear geometric pattern which encodes very profound geometric mathematical knowledge. Again, I'll link that in the description. Seshat. That's all. I hope you enjoyed. You can visit me on PayPal.